This is Left Hand. Welcome to Left Hand. I am your host, Sereptie, also known as Craig from the Acid Horizon podcast, and you've returned to my personal channel where I explore various topics related to my personal research. This channel is a space for me to air out ideas I'm chewing on or developing by doing deep dives into books I've read, have been meaning to read, or am even rereading. If you are a returning listener, I'm glad to have you back. And if this is your first time listening to Left Hand, welcome. Recently, I conducted a survey on the Left Hand Patreon account to gauge the interests of those supporting this endeavor. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and it seems many supporters want to hear more about mysticism, alchemy, and magic. At the same time, there's a significant interest in discussions on poststructuralism, French communism, and related topics. One of my goals is to integrate some of my own research in psychoanalysis and archetypal psychology into these discussions. Well, today we are all in luck because we're going to focus on a book that serves as a nexus for all of these topics, and it does so in a way that I think is very unique and quite unusual. Today, we are going to talk about salt, but not just ordinary table salt. We're diving into the concept of alchemical salt, as it was prevalent in the alchemical traditions of the Renaissance period and beyond. However, this discussion of alchemical salt will also focus on its appropriation by 20th century analytical and archetypal psychology and how the image of salt has been variously interpreted by Freudian psychology, by psychoanalyst Carl Jung, and by the archetypal psychologist James Hillman. To raise the stakes a little further, I want to connect these later interpretations of alchemical imagery to the work of 20th century philosopher Jacques Derrida, who shares overlapping assertions with Hillman in their respective theories of semantics. The primary text that I am drawing from is a compilation of essays put out by Spring Publications entitled Salt in the Alchemical Soul. It features the work of the authors I just mentioned, including Freudian psychologist Ernest Jones. There is an excellent and comprehensive introductory essay by Stanton Marlin, which does the good work of tying together the fascinating viewpoints of the writers in focus. Moreover, the work of these figures, combined with the metaphor of salt in alchemy, can help us today to articulate a hybrid theory of the formation and function of subjectivity within the space of that overlap and show its limits. Additionally, I aim to use these ideas to rebut a popular criticism of poststructuralism and probably more pointedly postmodernism, namely the claim that poststructuralist or postmodern theories reject the notion of stable essences, which is actually true in most cases, but the claim that I want to contest is that the loss of stable essences necessarily entails a loss of tangibility or the potential to positively affirm our experience. This latter claim, I believe, is false, especially in the context of the work of James Hillman and his theory of psyche. But before we dive in, please take a moment to visit my Patreon page where I host this content regularly and where you can support me for $5 a month. As of August 2024, I have committed myself to delivering at least 2 major releases each month, either long-form monologues like this one or in-depth interviews with experts on topics we love. In the last 30 days, I've released actually 3 full pieces, including a fascinating interview on Nietzsche with Devin Gouret. A big motivator for me has been the numerous people who have offered their support for independent scholarship and deep dives into philosophy and mysticism here on Left Hand. So thank you in advance for subscribing at the $5 level as you listen. So let's begin. Now, given that the focus of this video is going to be primarily on the work of James Hillman, it's probably important for me to get some listeners up to speed on who he is and what he is all about. Now, if you've been following Acid Horizon, there have been more than a couple videos and interviews where we discuss Hillman and his work. And I will share those in the show notes below if you want to take your own deeper dive into the material that we're covering here today. James Hillman is the founder of what is today known as archetypal psychology. He began his training under the guidance of Carl Jung and served then as the head of the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich from 1960 to 1969. While Jung's work was fundamental to the establishment of most of Hillman's core ideas, Hillman contested some of his teacher's central concepts, positioning himself as one of the first post Jungians. In an interview that I previously conducted with Grant Maxwell on Acid Horizon a few years ago, Grant suggested that Hillman's shift actually makes him more of a pre Jungian, given his strong fidelity to many Neoplatonic thinkers and the alchemical forebears, which laid the groundwork for depth psychology in the 20th century. And if I remember correctly, there are actually two interviews, and I will link them below. Archetypal psychology explores the psyche by viewing it through a rich tapestry of myth, image, and metaphor. It prioritizes the role of the imagination and the inherent multiplicity of meanings that shape our human experience. Hillman challenged the confines of a purely scientific or medical approach to psychology. Instead, he advocated for a poetic and symbolic understanding of psyche, or what he calls the soul. For Hillman, early psychoanalysis and the scientific positivism it embraced were precursors to a collective shift in the discipline and the psychoanalytic community at large. The goal of psychologizing for Hillman was not the medicalization of pathology. Rather, the multitudinous images produced by our dreams, our reveries, and psychological complexes are invitations to deepen the imagination and engage with what Hillman called soul making. And one distinction that we might want to make from the very beginning is that Hillman's concept of pathology differs radically from the concept of pathology that we find in other forms of psychology, which lean heavily on diagnostic typologies like the kind that we find in the DSM 4. Like the psychoanalysis of Carl Jung, Hillman's approach probes the archetypal layer of our experience. However, Hillman identified several challenges in Jung's approach and the general practice of clinical psychology. One key difference between Hillman and Jung is Hillman's deep critique of the ego self dyad. And this critique, of course, extends to Freud's conceptualization of conscious and unconscious life in the structure of the id, ego, and superego. One thing that we should put a pin in right from the start is that although Hillman accepts Jung's psychologizing of the world, he rejects his metaphysics. And also, as we move forward, we will talk about Hillman's concept of individuation, another concept he's also somewhat troubled by because of the way that most concepts of individuation, as they were understood in psychology, developmental concepts, tried to smuggle in a kind of teleology, which he avoids, and which he thinks is antithetical to the process of psychologizing. Hillman believed that Jung's theory of individuation lent itself to a monotheistic approach to the individuation process, ultimately leading to the realization of the self with a capital S, modeled on Christian metaphysics and more specifically Christian eschatology. In contrast, Hillman argued that there are multiple paths to individuation. Moreover, not all individuations engender the same character or destiny. Different people and things actualize in different ways, each privileging various forms of expression. Another significant difference between Jung and Hillman is Hillman's pronounced emphasis on the reciprocal relationship between the sociopolitical sphere and the domain of the collective imagination. But we'll set that aside for this discussion. The distinction most relevant to our discussion today lies in their approaches to the hermeneutics of the image. While Jung, in his explicit theoretical work, aside from his explorations that we see in the Red Book, tended to develop objective, albeit multiple associations with the imagery of the collective unconscious, Hillman focuses more on cultivating the analysand's ability to stick with images and engage with them in a way that did not reduce them to fixed, objective meanings. And it's also important to note that Hillman is trying to get out of the fantasy of psychotherapy itself and bring the imagination into a world that's not clinically bound. His unique and intimate orientation sought to counter some of the utilitarian and Promethean tendencies of 20th century psychoanalysis. In short, archetypal psychology eschews the domination and appropriation of images as mere tools for self improvement, instead, advocating for a view that treats images as lively entities, coexisting in a sort of shared ecology of the psyche. The Hillmanian perspective encourages an engagement with images that honors their complexity and allows them to reveal their meanings in ways that are not constrained by the ego's desires or intentions. In the end, Hillman emphasized that images should be respected for their intrinsic value and treated as participants in a dynamic interplay within the psyche. Now, to better establish the significance of the essays compiled in this book, Salt in the Alchemy of the Soul, it is important to explore the role of alchemy in archetypal psychology and the broader tradition of depth psychology. Alchemy, especially during the Renaissance, is often seen as a precursor to modern empirical science, particularly chemistry. But without the rigorous scientific methods we have today, what exactly were the alchemists doing when they attempted to do things like turn lead into gold? The short answer, and somewhat controversial answer if you are still a practicing alchemist today, which as I understand it, there are some people actually doing that. The short answer is that the division of alchemy and chemistry into distinct disciplines didn't separate the valuable from the worthless. Instead, the alchemical laboratory was revealed as a workshop of the imagination. What is known as alchemical psychology today became a means to bring the imagistic workings of our collective and personal psychology into sharper focus. Each historical alchemist, or the traditional schools of alchemy, expressed in their own way unique psychological differences through their divergent methods, revealing the deeply imaginative nature of the work. So, this book that I've been talking about, Salt and the Alchemy of the Soul, compiles the great works of three hermeneutical approaches to the substance of alchemical salt. The difference between these approaches are themselves worthy of investigation, but for our purposes, we'll focus on the work of Hillman, who briefly pays tribute to those who preceded him. Hillman writes, quote, "The psychological approach to salt has two major predecessors. Ernest Jones' The Symbolic Significance of Salt in Folklore and Superstition, and C.G. Jung's richly condensed chapter in Mysterium Conjunctionis. The main differences between their approaches and mine lie in our different aims. Where they examine salt in a scholarly manner in order to gain the objective meaning of this alchemical substance, I am attempting to bring over to the reader its substantiality as a commonly recognizable experience. Where Jung does a metapsychology of alchemy, I am trying to do an alchemical psychologizing. Hence, his chapter on salt and Jones' mainly anthropological amplification are indispensable backgrounds, even though they offer less experiential closeness to the material. I intend that my speaking about salt will bear traces of salt with it." End quote. When I initially planned this video, I thought I would break it down into individual sections on Ernest Jones and Carl Jung, but as I started to dig deeper, I realized that approach would probably stretch the video to 3 or 4 hours, especially given my tendency to chase down some of the precursors in each theorist's work. So instead of diving into exhaustive detail on each figure, I'll offer a brief overview of their roles in the history of alchemical studies, particularly as it sets us up to understand Hillman's work and the work of Derrida that I will bring in a little bit later. Ernest Jones and Carl Jung occupy distinct positions in a lineage that moves from a reductive, Oedipal interpretation of alchemical substances to a more expansive and multivalent perspective on the imagination. Jones, for example, reduces the symbolism of salt to an unconscious association with semen and insemination, firmly rooting the image in the Freudian tradition where the unconscious is seen as a site of sexual repression. Jung, on the other hand, approached alchemical substances like salt by weaving together a multiplicity of associations in an effort to derive an objective meaning. As Hillman points out, while Jung's method might seem overly academic and even reductive in its attempt to impose scientific rigor, it is not without value. Jung's work generates rich imaginative content, but where it perhaps falls short is in its shift from psychologizing the image to simply cataloging it, a psychological inventory, if you will. What really concerns Hillman is the way salt functions as a psychological residue, almost as a molecular force. In the very act of psychologizing, Hillman's approach just doesn't add to the archive of meanings, as Jung might have done. Instead, he actualizes the psychological process he's describing. By thoroughly engaging with the image of salt, Hillman isn't just discussing its various meanings, he's embodying them in his text, evoking the flavor, the sting, and the other psychological properties of salt in a way that is both theoretical but also quite experiential. In his essay, The Suffering of Salt, James Hillman dives into the dense, multifaceted symbolism of salt, weaving it through both alchemical and psychological landscapes to reveal how deeply it resonates with our transformative processes. Hillman draws a compelling parallel between the alchemical process of separating lead from salt and our own psychological journey, where we're tasked with distilling the heavy, burdensome aspects of the psyche to uncover something pure, something more refined. It's about stripping away the weight of our accumulated experiences, much like how salt purifies and preserves to find the essence that lies beneath. But Hillman doesn't stop at purification. He explores how salt activates our emotional depths, stirring up those latent feelings and bringing them to the surface, making them accessible and unavoidable. Salt, in this sense, isn't just a stabilizer, it's a catalyst that prevents our inner world from tipping into chaos. It holds us together when we might otherwise fragment, grounding our psychological structures even as it sharpens our awareness of the wounds that we have endured and the scars that we bear. Hillman's imagery goes even further in this piece, describing trauma as a salt mine, where the residues of painful experiences accumulate and crystallize, leaving enduring imprints on the soul. These residues, much like the crystallized salt left behind in alchemical processes, etch themselves into our psyche, creating a map of where we've been and how we've suffered. This ties into an old alchemical concept of sal sapientia, the wisdom of dry souls, where the hardships that we endure distill into a deeper, more mature understanding of life. Now, if you've been following my work on the Acid Horizon podcast, perhaps you've encountered our discussion with Keegan Kjeldsen of the Nietzsche podcast, where we explore the fragments of Heraclitus, who himself advises adhering to the wisdom of dry souls. And while views on what Heraclitus meant in this fragment vary, we offer you some salt here to flavor your own interpretation. I will also link that discussion in the show notes if that's something that you might be interested in. But back to Hillman. Hillman asserts that salt permeates our language and our social structures. Phrases like worth one salt and salt of the earth speak to the value of things like integrity and groundedness that salt symbolizes within the social order. Yet Hillman is keen to point out that salt in alchemy is far from monolithic. Drawing on the traditions of Paracelsus, he notes that alchemical salt includes a variety of substances: alums, alkalis, crystallizations, ashes, all of which evoke a spectrum of sensations from bitterness and astringency to sharpness and poignancy. These sensations, often linked to feelings of guilt and resentment, underscore the complex and sometimes painful nature of psychological transformation, where the sting of salt is both a reminder and a teacher, pushing us towards soul and self awareness. For Hillman, salt is more than just a metaphor, though. It's a foundational element of psychic life, a substance that permeates our collective psyche as a common thread running through the organic and inorganic realms. And now, of course, that sounds like a metaphor, but what Hillman is trying to say is definitional about psychic life in a sense, that there is this force that grounds and preserves, and that is alchemical salt. Alchemical salt sparks continuity, stability, and the preservation of the cosmos, grounding our experiences and preserving their substance. Yet, as salt works its way through us, it leaves behind residues, impressions, wounds, scars. Those things calcify and they shape us. And they also mark the intersection of pain and memory with our bodies and our souls. And here we might consider Nietzsche's theory of ressentiment, the spirit of revenge that infuses our actions and beliefs, a concept which denotes how we might be anchored to a residuum of the past that we cannot forget. Hence, the saltiest among us are those who cannot adequately exorcise the residues of painful memories. Hillman's connection between salt and subjectivity overlaps with Nietzsche's theory of resentment. For Nietzsche, the retention of painful memories cultivates within us a will to punish, a desire to reciprocate injuries that have, in fact, evolved into various punitive social practices and methods of exacting justice. Thus, it is precisely by virtue of a collective adherence to social norms regarding reward and retribution that we become subjects. And of course, if you've been following my work and our work as Acid Horizon, this is a theme that's explored deeply in the work of French philosopher Michel Foucault. Resentment, therefore, creates a kind of common substance or a commoning substance, one which is realized in varying logics of justice, and each of which has at its base the relationship between creditor and debtor, in short, an economy of retribution. But the risk of pegging the image of alchemical salt to a theory of resentment is failing to articulate what might be its positive dimension, but of course, which includes some negatives as well. For Hillman, the image of salt expresses the tangibility of our experience through salt's ability to elicit the taste of events in their particularity. In fact, one of the reasons I wanted to explore this very strange topic for a video is to bring attention to a specific problem in Hillman's work: the tendency of psychoanalysis and its various offshoots to construct an image of our lives as a progressive, developmental march towards a sense of unity and wholeness, the mastery of the self, as it were, versus, as Hillman puts forward, our lives as a substantialization of something that is utterly different, whose very becoming, if it could be defined, might be best characterized as a perpetual subversion of mastery and of systematic knowledge by a part of ourselves we might call an ungovernable excess. Now, Hillman was not a political anarchist. If anything, his politics kind of swung pretty left liberal, though he did call for a revaluation of Marx at one point in his life. But we can see the intimations of something like an ontological anarchism in his view. Nevertheless, it is precisely in the image of salt that Hillman articulates a continuum of various metaphors which show how the paradoxical foundation of our existence, the very basis of our lives, and our self understanding, rooted in our suffering, our personal and collective pathology, contains within it both enlivening and deathly aspects. And it is through the image of alchemical salt that we can cast that continuum. Crystalline table salt, when it is viewed under a microscope, is cubic in shape. Similarly, alchemical salt, when psychologized, takes on a cubic character of sorts. As for Hillman, it is associated with grounding, structure, fixity, integration, and connecting disparate parts to create meanings, forming contiguous bodies of concepts and associations that bring clarity, and so on. Moreover, there is a specific enthusiasm associated with this activity, a kind of fervor, as Hillman would say. However, in the most extreme cases, the fervor of salt becomes a radical fixation on something, perhaps as an over identification with one aspect of ourselves or a personal project. Or it's manifested as a zealous commitment to a religious belief. Or, as Hillman observes, in its most extreme form, too much salt in one's life leads to getting stuck in psychological complexes, such as ruminating on past relationships or excessive dwelling on those moments in the past when we were hurt. It's important to note that for Hillman, fixity is not necessarily a bad thing. The structuring of our lives around images of stability can have the effect of attenuating streams of impulsive desire, if we are prone to that sort of thing. Maybe another way to cast that image is to say that the image of salt can be associated with the coagulation of a kind of desire prone to being set adrift or lost in wayward wanderings of the soul. In this way, salt has a preservative effect. Where the soul might be inclined to run, it is often by staying close to the site of pain, suffering, and struggle that we are transformed and made tangible. So, for those of us with a more mercurial nature, and if you are a student of classical alchemy, you probably know that mercury is one of the three primary substances in Paracelsus' formulation of alchemy. A strong mercurial tendency, in the psychological sense of the word, might indicate someone who's prone to running from a certain kind of pain or suffering, versus somebody who has a more, let's say, saline constitution might be more of a dweller when it comes to the memory of pain. Thus, for those of us who might run, perhaps there is a transformative moment waiting for us if we would allow ourselves some salt, if we were allow ourselves to stay with those painful memories, to psychologize in a manner that allows us to stay grounded and firm in the face of the return of that memory versus running from it. I am not a trained psychotherapist, just an avid reader, but it seems like a possible sound formulation from the standpoint of alchemical psychology. In any case, the tangibility or substantiality associated with salt describes perhaps one of the most crucial distinctions offered in Hillman's theory of subjectivity. We can contrast his view, which privileges the idea of life as a process of differentiation and particularization, with a model of subjectivity oriented towards the discovery of a unitary meaning for life, or a dialectical progression of our experience into a transcendent notion of our own truth. To be clear, and before we unpack this, it's not simply that life has multiple meanings or that life has nothing to do with meanings, but that our experience of individuation, or to put it better, our actual dwelling in psyche, engenders something irreducible to meaning, irreducible to even truth, and is always in excess of it. As an illustration, in one of Foucault's lectures on Nietzsche from 1971, he writes, according to Nietzsche, quote, "Knowledge is not made for truth. Truth arrives unexpectedly, preceded by the not true, preceded rather by something that we cannot say is either true or not true, since it is prior to the division specific to truth." With the image of salt on our tongues, we can venture an alchemical interpretation. The precursors to truth and to meaning are the sting, the fervor, and the enlivenment of the imaginal salt within the substrate of our experience. Stanton Marlin, a student of Hillman and a prominent archetypal psychologist in his own right, makes the connection between salt and the expected arrival of truth in the introduction of the book that we're talking about. The arrival of the truth and its subversion maintains the character of a kind of surprise, something beyond our conscious intention. Marlin connects the specific flavor of salt in Hillman's writing to another figure in the tradition of 20th century French philosophy, who is Jacques Derrida. Derrida's concept of dissemination refers to the instability of meanings, the idea that meanings and the authority of those who construct meanings remain troubled by various interventions beyond their control. If you've done any work on Derrida, perhaps you already know his discussion of the authority of the author and how outside readings of texts impose upon the initial intentions of the author. Even that aspect of his work pertains to what we're talking about here. Similarly to Hillman, Derrida criticizes a tendency common to the discipline of philosophy, in which the generative act of writing, creating concepts, for example, risks falling back into a recursive loop that prioritizes meaning over the generative effects of writing and the act of doing philosophy. Philosophers who are doing work in or around the poststructuralist and postmodernist traditions often found themselves at a threshold between a discursive position, which privileges things like truth, teleology, and transcendence, and this other position, which upholds particularity, multiplicity, and which deprioritizes a sense of semantic groundedness in favor of a posture capable of a creativity that dissipates this process of the crystallization of meaning. In this context, Derrida enjoins us to think about how we might do philosophy or engage in acts of writing that go beyond an insistence towards a dialectical relationship to the world. For him and for the other thinkers in the milieu at this time, the concept of the dialectic was seen as imposing upon the radical and generative multiplicity of life. In other words, the dialectic's inherent will to truth. The demand that the activity of thought subordinate itself to a rarefied, high in the sky concept of truth diminishes life and diminishes experience. It attempts to transcend the vivacity, the fervor, and the intensity which constitute it. And for Hillman, this is also a big risk when it comes to imaginal assault. When the desire for grounding and structure at the psychological level forecloses upon our need for uncertainty, surprise, new perspectives, and that aleatory aspect of our experience, which allows for new important differences to emerge, well, that gets put in danger. I believe that what Hillman and Derrida, in their similar but distinct ways, suggest has real stakes for how we deal with certain problems related to meaning and its claim on us. To illustrate this point, let's turn to an example. Someone for whom meaning is almost like a drug, a person so committed to the unshakable foundations of subjectivity that a poke or a prod at their worldview throws them into absolute crisis. And that person is, of course, one of the saltiest public figures alive today, Jordan Peterson. Peterson is an apt example in this case because he calls himself a Jungian, though I haven't heard him mention Hillman's work before, I don't think anyway. Nevertheless, it is probably no secret to a lot of you listening right now that Peterson maintains a deep disdain for anything of the postmodern variety. Derrida and Foucault, in particular, are among his perennial targets, and he views their work as being responsible for the evisceration of Western culture's essential kernels. For instance, as of this week in August 2024, just before recording this video, Peterson produced yet another 10-minute diatribe on YouTube targeting Michel Foucault and his influence on trends in gender and sexuality. There's no need to fully recapitulate Peterson's well-known views on the matter, so perhaps we'll just leave it to a sentence or two. Peterson believes that the work of Derrida and Foucault has undermined the solidity of established norms around gender and sexuality in exchange for new concepts, such as queerness, which, for Peterson and his interlocutor in this newest video, is ontologically groundless. They argue that the concept of queerness is predicated on the absence of gender identity, which then seduces naive youth into an existential vacuum where meaning is no longer possible and other dangers loom large. There is a whole host of problems with these claims. Well, the claims made in the video anyway, not the least of which is the idea that there is a single unified concept of queerness shared by academics. Whereas if you spent 20 minutes in any relevant online academic space, you would see that there are a plethora of perspectives on the matter. But leaving that aside for a moment, I believe there is a deeper ontological move made by Peterson, which informs his more general commitment to the need for meaning and stable essences. In fact, Peterson is an example of how a predilection for meaning as an anchor for complete existential stability can manifest into an obsessional fixation, one which excludes the process of particularization and differentiation, which is always in excess of meaning. Moreover, another claim made in Peterson's ramble is that the perpetrators of the notion of fluid identity have exacerbated the uncertainty and hopelessness now endemic to modern society, and that the psychological suffering produced by these paradigms coincides exactly with social disunity. The implication being that the return to a solidity of identities will bring about a restoration of social unity, at least in part. The first big problem with this, on a simple logical level, is that it begs the question regarding the relationship between stable identities and personal suffering. Ultimately, Peterson's view tells us nothing about the force and imperatives of social unity and what constitutes them. If, for instance, social unity is constructed as a panic room against anything that deviates from the norm, the outside of society is always going to be a precarious, if not hellish, space for anyone who deviates from the norm. Furthermore, if your social categories cannot accommodate the drift of identity outside prescribed boundaries, or to use Hillmanian language, if the activity of the psyche particularizes in a way that doesn't fit comfortably into the existing crystallizations of social identity, then it's going to create something combustible or explosive. And the thing is, it's going to do this anyway. As for Hillman, the character of the psyche is defined in part by that ungovernable and excessive nature of the psyche. In fact, there's an alchemical image which Hillman puts forward to describe this process. It is the contact of salt with another primary element of the alchemical opus, which is sulfur. In this sense, life occurs in and through sulfuric destabilizations of the saline crust of our accumulated experience. And when things get too combustible, that's when salt comes in as a regulating element. It's likely that much of Peterson's penchant for meaning derives from his reading of Jung, who, as we discussed in his own alchemical investigation, sought to find an objectivity in alchemical imagery through the exploration of these diverse associations and multiple meanings across the history of alchemy. This, on Hillman's account, as we said, is an improvement on someone like Ernest Jones, for example. But someone like Derrida would also agree that the privileging of multiple meanings, or what he calls polysemia, is in fact a step in the right direction, but for both Hillman and Derrida, this doesn't quite get to the heart of the matter. Now, with all of that in mind, and now that we've built up these sort of complementary accounts of Hillman's particularization of the psyche, and we've done a little bit with Derrida's concept of dissemination and generative multiplicity, let's hear a quote from a series of interviews that Derrida conducted in the early 1980s, compiled in a short book called Positions. These interviews cover much of the important work of Derrida laid out in titles such as Writing Indifference and Of Grammatology. And if you're on the fence about whether or not to pick up one of these texts, Positions might be a good place to start because it's relatively short. The interviews are a little bit more buoyant than some of the denser language that we get in these primary texts. But in any case, here's what Derrida writes. Quote, "The attention brought to bear on polysemia, or polythematism, doubtless represents progress in relationship to the linearity of the monothematism, writing or reading that is always anxious to anchor itself to the tutelary meaning, the principle signified of a text, that is, its major reference. Nevertheless, polysemia as such is organized within the implicit horizon of a unitary resumption of meaning, that is, within the horizon of dialectics." End quote. By the way, Stant Marlin, who we have to shout out again because he does such an excellent job in the introduction of this book that we're looking at, points to this very section in Positions. And it was actually because of this quote and the footnote included with it that I decided to chase this book down. So let's unpack the Derrida a little bit. When Derrida says that polysemia as such is organized within the implicit horizon of a unitary resumption of meaning, that is, within the horizon of dialectics, what he means is that embracing the multiplicity of meaning as an antidote to a universalized semantics does not get us out of the problem, which has long plagued philosophy and other discursive disciplines. Specifically, the subordination of speech acts or text to the primacy of semantics not only intervenes on an understanding of how writing and speech actually function, but it also demotes the creativity which itself generates meaning, and how the creative impulse also destroys those meanings, which mark an impasse to the realization and flourishing of certain forms of life. Simply put, and to put it in Hillman's terms, the discursive nature of metaphysics is often an obstacle to psychologizing our lives. Furthermore, the non discursive elements of clinical psychology and some other discursive elements as well have internalized that obstacle in its appropriation of pathology and the articulation of a diagnostic apparatus. While philosophy can produce some productive frameworks of analysis, both Hillman and Derrida see metaphysics as thwarting alternative forms of expression in the life of writing or in the life of the imagination. We can also draw an analogy between Derrida's criticism of the compulsion towards a dialectical metaphysics and Hillman's view of the sometimes imperious nature of our own psychological interiority. Now, how do we connect all of this back to the concept of alchemical salt? Hillman often draws upon the insights of the 16th century alchemist Paracelsus, who we've mentioned a few times already, to mine his own alchemical insights. One thing Paracelsus claimed was that our desire for salt derives from our own salinated natures, and that our enjoyment of salty foods, for example, pointed to salt's inherent desire for itself. Kind of a strange thought, but of course, we're dealing with a different set of ground rules in the alchemical imagination. Now, what's this all about? Why do I bring this up now? Well, because it presents a kind of useful metaphor. That salt, as the basis of our experiences, engenders a taste for feeding off itself at the expense of closing off its appetite for other substances. In other words, it preempts those differences which transform our experience. It is when we become trapped in the salt mines that we succumb to this autophagia. When our sense of interiority becomes locked in a series of recursive reflections, recriminations, and activations of bad conscience, it's then that salt begins to take its toll on our soul. Similarly, for Derrida, to be able to think beyond the dialectical cordoning off familiar to philosophy, a habit of conceptual creativity that is consigned to an endless refurbishing of binary distinctions and a making dialectical of the world, we expose ourselves to the totalizing tendencies of hitherto Western thought. Interestingly, Hillman and Derrida also share a disdain for the tyranny of a fervent oppositionalism in the realm of thought and concepts, but perhaps we can save that for another time. Let's bring this back to Jordan Peterson. Like Jung, Peterson can accommodate a breadth of meanings insofar as they buttress the alleged objectivity of meaning, or at least support a project that endeavors to defend it. For example, Peterson, in his recent online screed, finds a place for gays and lesbians who contribute to the social totality and embrace flourishing within a prescribed social context. But what Peterson cannot tolerate is a breach of the enclosure of meaning itself, something that would unsettle the stability of meanings and the productivity of the social unity. In contrast, the difference in Hillman's psychology compared to that of his Jungian contemporaries is that processes of individuation cannot be wholly circumscribed by meanings. The life of the soul or psyche is marked by an intensive process as much as an extensive one, the former referring to the intimate and sensate unfolding of differences, and the latter having to do with the opacity of this process to the world of shared meanings. Consequently, in Hillman's practical work, he prefers that we engage with the imagination in a way that sticks with images and fosters an attitude of creating an ecology of the psyche in which we allow our imagination to suffuse our lives more deeply, versus making the contents of our imagination correspond with a psychoanalytic or psychiatric rubric. In contrast, Peterson's notion of social unity conspires with the medicalization of pathology to embolden the respective imperative force. This is the salt of an utterly rigid social homogeneity. Salt in extremis, a crystal cave which intends to bind all differential processes associated with the pathos of our suffering, so that this suffering can be made legible or intelligible in socially accepted terms. And perhaps I will conclude with a short postscript based on some listening that I've been doing recently. I recently acquired the audiobook Art, Practice, and Philosophy of Psychotherapy, which is a series of seminars by James Hillman. And one of the reasons that it's interesting is that this is the late work of Hillman. And one of the things that he attempts in the first lecture in that series is a challenging of his own long held assumptions about the process of individuation. Now, as I mentioned at one or two points in the preceding discussion, Hillman has a unique and multiplicitous notion of individuation. However, in the context of these lectures that I downloaded, he suggests that even a liberal approach to the concept of individuation tends to smuggle in things like development, teleology, and the imposition of a certain structure of thought that imposes itself upon the activity of psychologizing. And this is something that can emerge out of the paternalistic or maternalistic tendencies of a counselor or a psychotherapist. Or to use Foucauldian terms, this is an exercise of a kind of pastoral power when we use these frameworks as a way to guide expressions of psyche. On the other hand, Hillman suggests that those therapists who have been trained in a specific discipline rather than those who've had a smattering of this and that to build up their clinical practice have the advantage of being able to return to a space, a familiar space, when they get lost or when they become afraid in the process of developing their practice or their encounters with their own psychological content. I think we can venture an analogy here too for those of us who are involved with philosophy, those of us who have pegged our philosophical practice to a specific figure, a specific school, or a specific tradition, have the advantage of having a kind of home base when it comes to our conceptual thought. But the home base, of course, can also function as an impediment to thinking the new. And to be clear, in the context of these seminars that I've been listening to, Hillman also says, look, on any given day, I'm of a different mind about these things, which is to say that some days perhaps he is in that analytical mode, and other days he is more in the psychological mode. And if any of you who are listening are into psychology, into mysticism, into alchemy, or have some sort of embodied practice, these are interesting tensions to navigate. And the one connection that I wanted to make, even though it wasn't explicit in the Hillman lecture that I listened to, is that there is an element of salt here as well. If we are the type inclined to this intense cleavage to a particular philosophical figure or tradition, analytical framework, or heuristic, this, of course, can get in the way of the embodied practice, of the activism, of the political work. And most importantly, for someone like James Hillman, an excessive centering on a particular concept stems the life of the imagination and our relationship with it. Perhaps a final point to add on this specific note and to bring in the concept of alchemical salt one last time, Hillman, in these later lectures, in his critique of individuation, of development, and so forth, emphasizes once again something that we talked about here, which is unexpectedness, surprise, and the aleatory nature of the psyche. It's not that the psyche already has a path charted out for it. And even if it did, the question is, how would we know? How would we know in advance? How would we know the trajectory of that track? On the other hand, a potential antinomy here is that maybe it's the case that our ease and comfortability with this random emergence that we see from the font of fantasy, this aleatory nature of the psyche, this term that I keep using, that unknown of what is about to happen next, the new fantasy into which we will be thrown, and the soft but implicit demand that we accept whatever is coming down the pike in our psychological life is part of that process of individuation. To borrow a term from the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, it's not necessarily that there is an end point in developing a relationship with the imagination, in developing a relationship with psychological life. The point, if there is one, is a kind of becoming intense, which means achieving in our own unique way a kind of athleticism of our own soul, the cultivation of the knowledge of our own specific intensity with regards to the emergence of various images that come to structure our lives or push us into new places. With that said, I want to say thank you for listening to another episode of Left Hand, the simple and easy and relatively affordable way to support this independent scholarship is to navigate to my Patreon page and become a $5 member. Or if you are adventurous and you want to be one of the prospective angel supporters, once I start adding more features and things like that, support at the $10 level. Or I think I even have another tier, $25 level, the $1,500 level. There's nothing like that there yet, but I am extremely grateful for all of those who have supported so far, and I want to say thank you to all of you right now. For the time being, left hand subscribers will get these episodes and interviews early. Another big way that you can help is just recommend this work to others, share it on social media, and go back and listen to some of the older episodes, especially if you're listening in 2027, if the world is still around by then. In any event, take care of yourselves, and there is more on the way soon.